Hello, students typically have the hardest time with the definition argument out of all three of the 101 arguments. So I thought I would do a little video over the slideshow to help with that and hopefully ease that process a little bit. So let's go ahead and look into definition argument. I think that definition argument is one of the most important arguments that you write as a student because it is the argument that you might end up using in your day-to-day life more than any other type of argument. So questions of whether or not something is sexual harassment, or questions about whether or not something is racist. All of these are definition argument questions. So they work on this idea of creating value around a subject or a topic, and then they're very powerful arguments because they can exclude something from that value or they can include something within that value. So in a way, definition argument works on this idea of inclusion and exclusion. And that's something that currently in our society is very significant and is being talked about at all levels. So definition argument will help you see how politicians and journalists and lawyers, Supreme Court justices, create these definitions around terms to include or exclude groups. So for example, marriage and who can get married is a question of definition argument. So currently, the Supreme Court has argued that marriage is not a religious institution, it is a state institution, and so therefore we can have same-sex marriage. So before that, LGBTQ plus people were excluded from the practice of marriage. But now, because the definition has been established to include those groups, now they are included. So definition argument is something that will impact you as an American because these are the questions that the Supreme Court answers. So for me, that makes definition argument really exciting. Now, you can pick to choose a topic that is really serious and super controversial. Or the other thing about definition argument is that you can pick a topic that's lighthearted and fun. So it runs the gamut of those argumentative choices. So they also help us understand that words and their meanings and definitions change over time. So language is a very dynamic thing. It's always changing. Culture is a dynamic thing. It's always changing. So you only have to look at words that we no longer use because we know those words are hurtful and damaging because they've taken on definitions of traumatic negativity. And so these are things that are constantly happening and changing over the course of time. And definition argument tries to crystallize on those moments and tries to show you, well, here's how that's happening. And then, of course, definition can be used in a bad way. It can be used negatively. It can be used to, group and label groups of people and to disempower and disenfranchise those groups of people. So it's a very powerful style of writing, thinking, and can be very persuasive. So that's just a little bit about the importance of definition argument and why I think it's important for students to write a definition argument, even though it seems to be the one that students struggle with the most. So let's move on to the next slide here. So this is just kind of looking at values and argument. So another issue kind of we have in our society right now is that there's sort of this distrust of opinion. And I think that your opinions are colored by your values. And in the early chapters of the book, there was information about, your values and beliefs. And from writing the classical argument that those values and beliefs that you have are colored by your personal experience. So in a way, your beliefs and values are unique to you. So for us to expect all people to have the same beliefs and values is not sane, really, because not everyone has had the same experiences. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to work within values and beliefs. And they're more than just an opinion. An opinion is something that you might have, but you don't have anything to really back that up. It's cloudy and murky, or maybe it's just something you're repeating that someone else has said. But a belief or a value is something you have experienced, or it's something you've researched and broadly researched both sides, and you have a strong value or belief based on this wide-ranging research that you have completed. So opinion's kind of a dirty word, but belief and value, that's where we're kind of, so for example, people who have families that work in the coal industry, they're going to value coal and coal mining. People who do not have families who work in the coal industry are not going to necessarily value coal and coal mining. And so there's going to be this clash between those two groups. And in a way, both of them are correct. Coal mining is bad for the environment. But losing a bunch of jobs is going to be bad for the people in that industry. So what we need to understand and recognize is that values are valid. And to dismiss someone's values is a very painful thing for that person to experience. So this is really getting into the complexities and the heart of argument. So it's not easy. It's not something you can be dismissive or condescending with. It's something that you have to really engage with, and you have to work through and figure out what you have as your value and belief about a topic. So definition is difficult, and a lot of words that we seek to define are difficult to define, and lots of issues make definition difficult to do. So keep all of that in mind as we kind of start working through some of these specifics about definition argument. So we're using this claim type, and this isn't math, so don't freak out. The best thing I think about the claim type is it gives you a template to use. Now, the template here is going to be X is or is not a Y. As a student, you can choose if you want to use is a Y or is not. So that's just there as a choice. So you'll see down on the example, spanking children is, and then the not is in parentheses, discipline. So that means that you could write a paper that argues spanking children is discipline, or there could be a paper, spanking children is not discipline. So a key point within definition argument is this idea of rule of justice. So with spanking, there is going to be a point where spanking crosses the line, and it's no longer discipline, and it's more akin to abuse. So your job as the definer and the writer of definition argument, if you were to do this topic, would be to establish where that line is. is. And that's where the definition will begin. So if you think about spanking on a continuum, over on one end, you're going to have people who are opposed to spanking, and they do not spank. And then on the other extreme end, you'll have people who spank too much, and they are involved in child abuse. And so you want to put, if you're going to do spanking is discipline, you want to argue for a definition of spanking that is different from those two extremes. So you're going to argue for something that is much more moderate. So there's a couple of different approaches you can take to definition. So you can actually create a definition, and that's asking what is X. So all of these claims deal with some form of terrorism. So we might argue terrorism is any non-wartime act of violence undertaken for political gain. So we have a lot of protests and riots that have been happening, and some people classify those as terrorism. And then other people have classified the acts of police brutality as terrorism. So even in our current climate, there could be uses for these definitions, or thinking about the idea of terrorism and what is that. Traditionally, as a country, we have associated terrorism with 9/11. But these would try to argue or shift or change that idea and apply terrorism to a broader spectrum of violence. So you can challenge a definition by arguing that an Y is not an X. So violence undertaken as part of a revolt against an oppressive regime is not terrorism. And then you can try to determine if something fits an existing definition. So this just happened over the weekend or toward the end of last week. The FBI has arrested a couple of members of the Wolverine Watchman militia group in Michigan for a supposed plot to kidnap the governor. So we might ask, okay, well, is this militia group a terrorist organization? And we're not talking about all militia groups here, notice. We're talking about this very specific group that is currently in the news. So we could define terrorist organization and then look at this group and see if they are similar. So a known terrorist organization is Al-Qaeda. So we could look at that. We could look at the structure of that organization. And we could create some criteria for what a terrorist organization is, and then we could see if that criteria applied to the Wolverine Watchman militia group. So here are some questions that are issue questions that would lead to definition argument. So should a woman be held to the same physical requirements as a man in order to join the military? So the answer to that could be women should be held to the same physical requirements, or women should not be. Should everyone pay the same percentage of their income taxes regardless of their income? Are high SAT scores a fair condition for entrance into universities? So your argument strategy that you're going to be using is criteria match. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to stop the video here, and then we'll pick up with this slide with part 2.